It was a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mom in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was just taking the two youngest of my 3 children, then ages 1 and 3, to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building off of a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep Cherokee we had owned for 2 years, was one of only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when we arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home. As the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the key. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in. I asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come but that it might be a bit. So I told him my location, left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows, and loaded the children back into their seats once more as we waited. Soon we watched as all the lights were turned out in the building again and everyone left. Their cars departed one by one from behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in the parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot, and so on. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to be quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot pretty soon, and a man got out of his pickup. He smiled and nodded to me, saying he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit scruffy, but quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes look that way, especially at the end of the day, and I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine, but he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab jumper cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood as we waited. More than once he said that it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here really quick, he would show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that sadly there was no reason to show me anything, as I didn't know anything about cars. I just thanked him and continued to stay in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition that was surely coming any moment. At one point I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting as he spoke, but I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot and tired and miserable, and truthfully I was distracted with the kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little frustrated with me because I wouldn't come up and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad and have him leave us there all alone with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, this nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very quickly without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me there alone with two little ones, defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed like the Southern gentleman thing to do. I looked around and was very aware once again that there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, also unmarked pickup pulled in next to me, I got out of the car once again, this time more apprehensively. Upon exiting, though, he immediately introduced himself, and his name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone much earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, pointing and asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know, I thought all this time he was you." We both laughed slightly as he then grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front of my car, raised the hood, and started to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, the air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening for the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice he said, Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked into his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish rust, yet on one end it had tiny circular small finger holes, as if it were a mix of a long thin sword and scissors, oddly combined. I remember being amazed but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said just matter-of-factly that I had never seen them before, but how weird was it that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years, and shook my head in surprise. He continued to stand there and stare at them unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, like he couldn't find the words to speak for a bit, just continuing to stare at the unusual object. Honestly, I didn't care one bit about it. All I could think of was getting the car going, paying him, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly set them on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep. When it immediately caught, my 3-year-old cheered. Grateful, I quickly turned on the air conditioner full blast, rolled up all the windows, aimed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him so I could hear the amount now owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up that weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time." He held them out for closer inspection. This time, I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality except for the strangely small 2 loops on one end. I had never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me as if trying desperately to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, 'cause they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head no and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." to which he pointed more closely and replied, "But see how sharp they are. These look like they've just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny, dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip, where the rust had been removed, were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted the item. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I released the back window so he could place it inside. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way, me turning the other towards the small winding highway that would lead home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home and I got the children inside safely. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like thing to them later. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears from my description and measurements on the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I remember wondering how he would even know that, why he would say that. I had tried so carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that they might be able to lift prints or test it for blood if they wanted. But the story seemed to bore him a bit and he didn't seem interested. His attitude insinuated that, as there was no longer an emergency, it was of no importance now. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things up, he did say that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days, just in case someone from his office got back with me later. But that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house. And there they remained for several more years, untouched, until we moved away and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time, though, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did. If my children would still have a mother, if I would have still had my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know, but I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people and staying safe, but because I was exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit and wasn't working at that time. And many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could easily have cost us our lives. Appreciate each and every one of you. Stay safe. Yesterday, I called in sick to work. I wanted to stay home and work on a paper for grad school. Plus, I wasn't feeling up to working on a Friday. In the late afternoon, all of my roommates were out. My fiancé and one roommate went out to a bar, and the third had left for work. While working on my paper and surfing the internet, I heard a knock on the door. We live on the 4th floor with no elevator, so when someone actually comes up, they usually have a good reason. I immediately got up and headed toward the front door. About halfway down the hall, I realized it could be my boss or a coworker coming to check if I was feeling well. They've been to my apartment before and it's like them to visit. With that in mind, I decided to peek through the peephole to see if I needed to pretend to be sick. It wasn't them. Have you ever had your gut scream, "Don't open the door"? This was one of those times. 2 white men, probably in their late 20s, were standing at my door with a duffel bag. They were quietly chatting with each other, but I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. Both had thick Eastern European accents, maybe Russian or Ukrainian. I paused and kept watching them through the peephole. They seemed friendly enough, but I've seen enough horror movies to know that opening the door could be a bad idea. Besides, I was in pajamas without a bra. I didn't need someone trying to sell me something. I watched as they went to the next door, knocking on that one too. There are 4 apartments on our floor, so I observed them knock on each one. Slowly, I turned the lock on my door, making sure to do it quietly. If they were selling something, I didn't want to insult them by loudly locking the door. They didn't seem to notice. Their quiet conversation continued, and I think I heard them talking about the Final Four basketball game that night. One of my neighbors opened her door. I don't know her name. Most people on our floor keep to themselves, but I saw her move in a few months ago. I ran into her again when the fire alarms went off at 6 in the morning. She has a fat cat and works early, that's all I know. The men spoke louder and I could hear them talking about perfume. Around here, it's not uncommon for people to sell knockoff designer perfumes or some kind of natural stuff made of lavender or other ingredients. They held up some bottles from the duffel bag to show her, and though I couldn't hear her reply, she retreated into her apartment, and the men followed, closing the door behind them. I went back to working on my paper, feeling silly for being scared of 2 guys selling overpriced perfume. A couple of hours later, after one of my roommates returned from work, there was another knock on the door. This time, I didn't overthink it. I just opened the door. To my surprise, it was a police officer. I could see the flashing lights from the ground floor. There were a couple of patrol cars. The officer apologized for disturbing us so late. It was around 11 p.m., and asked if anyone was home earlier in the day. I told him I was, and he proceeded to ask me questions like, "Did you hear anything unusual? Or did you see anyone you didn't know in the complex?" I immediately mentioned the 2 men. He nodded and wrote down some notes as I gave a basic description, though I couldn't describe them too well since I only saw them through the peephole and don't have the best memory for faces. He took my contact information, thanked me for my help, and left. Her apartment door was closed, and there wasn't any police tape or sign that they were inside. This morning, I heard a lot of noise on the stairs. When I looked out, I saw a moving truck. My neighbor's husband was helping carry boxes and bags downstairs, almost like the hurried moves I used to do in college with belongings thrown into trash bags. I went back inside. A few hours later, I received a community-wide email from our leasing office advising residents not to open the door for strangers under any circumstances. I had a package waiting at the office, so I went to pick it up. While in the mailroom with the receptionist, I casually mentioned that my neighbor was moving out so soon after moving in. Offhandedly, she said, "I'd move too if that happened to me." When I asked what she meant, she immediately clammed up and started rushing me out. I have no idea what happened, but I'm glad we're moving to a new apartment soon. Update 1. I spoke with someone else at the leasing office, taking the approach of a concerned tenant worried about being robbed. I talked to a community captain who helps the tenants with problems, and flat out asked if my neighbor had been robbed. She hesitated but eventually said, "Well, yeah." She followed up by saying the couple didn't want the details to be shared. I might have hit a dead end, but I'll try to follow up with the receptionist tomorrow. Am I allowed to ask the police what happened since it was so close to me? Update 2. Earlier this evening around 8 p.m., I overheard some neighbors chatting while I was walking upstairs. Sadly, many of you guessed it. She was assaulted. I wasn't going to share this. As someone mentioned, we should respect their privacy and wishes. However, I'm sharing it now because I want to emphasize how scared I am. While I was submitting my paper late at night, yay procrastination, I heard a knock on someone else's door. Since it was almost midnight, there wasn't much noise to drown it out. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was one of my cats, but then I definitely heard a knock on my door. I was too terrified to check the peephole, so I called the police. Hopefully that helps. Update 3. False alarm. It turns out some teenagers were trying to scare people in the complex after reading the email. Multiple people called the police, so it seems our floor was randomly chosen. The cops picked up the kids and called me back to let me know everything was fine. One year ago, I, a 17-year-old, befriended a young man 18 years old on Discord. We matched each other's humor and had quite a few things in common. He was secretive about himself, so it was always a surprise when he opened up, which kept me deeply invested in getting to know him. We got along very well and spent many evenings chatting and discussing things. I was introduced to 2 more of his friends, well, more like classmates. Let's call them Steve and Luke. Their little trio had a strange dynamic. Steve and the young man, whom I much later got to know as Tom after he finally revealed his name, were quite close and tended to treat Luke as their little plaything. This made me feel rather empathetic towards Luke, and I tended to take his side more in arguments, leading to them often joking that he'd show up to my house with flowers if I kept defending him. There was a slight rivalry between everyone in the former trio. My arrival only made things more tense as all of them started to badmouth each other to me in private. Eventually, Tom and Steve began to avoid Luke and prevent him from joining our conversations. This continued for a while until Tom suddenly became strange towards me. He started to delete all the messages he sent me and removed me from his friend list everywhere. This happened a few times before I was fed up with all of them. I broke ties and honestly should have never picked them up again. Hey, remember me? We used to talk. Who is this? It's me, Steve. Me and Tom started a Minecraft server and want to join. I eagerly agreed and got invited to the corresponding Discord server. There were a few others in there who are not relevant to the story. I got along with most of the people, but especially with Steve. Even outside of the Minecraft server and public group voice chats, we spent time together. We went down internet rabbit holes about how Islamic pixie fairies with pride flags would save the universe and such. Our mutual interest in these rabbit holes filled much of the conversation topics when we talked. This changed after the 17th of March, 2024, when at 8:35 p.m. I received 8 missed calls from Steven with the text, "Pick up, you'll never forget this." Me, "Wait, give me a moment." Steve, "Pick up, when do I ever call you randomly? It's important." Ongoing call on March 17th at 8:50 p.m. Steve turned on his camera and asked me a short question that still makes me feel nauseous. "This is your house, right?" I remained silent for a second and tried to deny it was my house. Then another voice spoke up, belonging to Tom. "It was surprisingly easy tracking you down from your mother's Facebook backyard view pictures, haha. When I tell you I felt sick to the bone, I mean it." I remember quickly putting on a sweater and grabbing my phone. At the time, my mind worked on autopilot, and I just wanted to get them away as soon as possible. My mother asked me why I was going out in the middle of March at 9 p.m. during a rainy night. At the time, I lied to her, saying that friends were there. "No way, you're actually real," was the first thing Tom said when I opened the wooden gate in our garden. Both men stood with their backs to the streetlights. and I didn't have the courage to shine my phone flashlight on them. I remained close to the door as Stephen offered me a puff of their cigarette. I declined politely and stood there in awkward silence as the two males stared at me. The conversation was very dry and not deep. Every minute I stayed longer made my stomach twist more and more. It felt so off. I stayed there for about 30 minutes before they offered the following. "Want to go with us to our car?" I immediately declined and turned around to close the wooden gate to the garden again. Before I could, Tom quickly added that it was a joke and insisted on drinking a cup of coffee inside with my parents. I declined and desperately tried to get them to leave. Eventually they did, and I sent them a message saying, "Thanks, man, I feel unsafe in my own home now." "Sorry, hope we didn't scare you badly," he added. I brushed the weird event off and went on with life, though I did find myself checking more often if there were people outside waiting for me. On the 29th of April, Steve messaged me again. "Are you home?" "No." "Are you sure the lights in your room are on?" "I am not home, go away." "But I can see you, lol. Look at the window on your left." There I went again to see them, this time in daylight. They had once again shown up to my doorstep together. This was my first time seeing their faces. Steve waved and nervously smiled, and I nodded. "What's it this time?" "Want to go to our friend's house together with us?" "No, I don't. Please don't waste your gas driving all the way here." Yet they didn't stop. Steve begged me to allow him to go inside to fill his water bottle and for Tom to use the restroom. I declined both and pointed for Tom to relieve himself somewhere in the field. Eventually, I gave in and took Steve's water bottle inside to fill. When I came back, they were suddenly satisfied and happy to go back to their car and leave. Of course, not before making a weird request. "May I give you a handshake?" When I tell you it was awkward, humans have this sense of how long it's okay to shake someone's hand before it becomes weird. He did not. He held my hand for a solid 4 seconds, only to make a joke about never washing his hand again afterward. On the 6th of May, Steve messaged me, "Hey, we need to talk. I really want to tell you something." After a long conversation, it finally became clear what his intentions were. Steve told me he liked me. I quietly listened as he said everything. The worst part was that he knew I had a boyfriend as well. I politely declined his confession and decided that it was enough. I was going to cut all ties with these people. Following that decision, multiple alt accounts sent me messages apologizing, but I never responded to them. On the 15th of June, which was my birthday, a card dropped on the doormat. "For all the tears and pain, grief also gives you emotional gain," was printed on the front of the card, and inside I found a short message. "Happy birthday, have fun, look in your cabinets." It was a funeral grievance card. After this, there was complete silence. "So weird, Discord duo, let's not meet again." This took place when I was around 8 or 9 years old, so I guess it would have been the year 1997. My parents had gotten divorced several years prior, so me and my little sister, 2 years younger, used to stay with our dad every other weekend. One day he introduced us to his new girlfriend, Rachel, who was a tall blonde woman that had apparently won some kind of beauty pageant or something. I remember those first months of getting to know Rachel as fun. She seemed like a nice lady. I also think my initial impression of her was helped by the fact that she had a rather cuddly gray parrot and a pet raven that could talk, which of course made my younger self quite ecstatic. But after a while, things started to change. I began to notice she could be a bit odd at times, saying weird things or acting a bit strangely. We started seeing her less frequently when staying with our dad. Then one day he told us they'd broke up and that we wouldn't be seeing her anymore. He also told us we shouldn't talk to her or go home with her if she showed up at school. Not long after that, Rachel really started harassing my dad. She would randomly turn up at places we went to visit during weekends, trying to talk with us. She called him non-stop on the phone when we were at home, crying and making threats. It usually didn't stop until he pulled the plug. Years later, I found out she had even threatened to kill me and my sister on several occasions, and that Dad got a restraining order. Rachel also keyed my dad's car, broke into his company to trash it, and stole a lot of money that he never got back. She even started writing threatening letters to my mom. My parents have always been good friends ever since the divorce, and it all culminated with a letter from the authorities. A letter accusing my dad of being a child predator. I still vividly remember how Mom sat us down in our room, holding the letter, a deep look of concern on her face, asking if Dad had ever touched us inappropriately, which of course he never has. It later turned out it was Rachel who had falsely accused him of such in an attempt to prevent him from seeing us. I remember feeling really angry and upset that she had gone to such lengths. The last memory I have of Rachel was a few weeks before Christmas. We were staying at my dad's place over the weekend. It was a 2-story apartment complex with a large window spanning an entire wall, floor to ceiling, in the living room where we had just sat down to watch TV. Next to the window there was a glass door leading onto a stone patio, bordering a lawn that ended with a tall hedge, and on this particular day the outdoor lights had been switched off, which means it was pitch black outside as the intro to Superman started playing. A while into the episode, I suddenly heard a strange, sharp noise coming from the window. It sounded like something was clawing on the glass in an attempt to get in. The sofa I was sitting on was placed right in front of the window, so I had my back toward it when I slowly turned around to look over my shoulder, heart thumping in my chest, hair standing on end as if I was being watched. But all that came into view was a pitch-black darkness lurking behind my own reflection. By this point, Dad had also heard the sound and gotten up to turn on the patio lights. When the outside suddenly flooded with light, I found myself staring into the face of a smiling blonde woman peering into our living room. Need I tell you that I screamed? Both me and my sister flew up from the couch like it had been scorched with fire and ran behind our dad. When I looked toward the window again, I saw Rachel with both of her hands up against the glass, tightly cupped beside her face as she was trying to look inside. The patio door was right next to her. I tugged on Dad's shirt and whispered if the door was locked when she reached toward the handle. That millisecond of doubt flashing across my dad's face still haunts me to this day. Rachel truly looked like a mad woman as she furiously jerked on the handle in an attempt to get in, briefly pausing to peer through the glass now and again. I remember thinking Dad looked oddly calm as he ushered us around a corner wall, telling us to stay out of sight as he walked toward the patio door. We begged him not to go outside, thinking she could have a knife hidden somewhere. So he opened up a small crack with the door, firmly holding on to the handle, and asked what the hell she was doing in his backyard. She tried to get him to let her in, putting on a big smile, tossing her hair, but Dad obviously wouldn't budge, telling her to leave or he would call the cops, to which she eventually conceded, leaving a bunch of Christmas presents behind. When Rachel was out of sight from the window, Dad went out to make sure she was gone, picking up what she had left behind on his way back. None of us wanted anything to do with the presents. Something just felt really off about them, so they ended up still fully wrapped in the trash. This story happened back when I was in college around 1998. I went to school on a converted military base. The base had been shut down, and a small part of it was now a campus. This meant there were a lot of back roads that were essentially abandoned, except for the local and military police who still patrolled the site. I lived in a small apartment on the base which was converted from officers' quarters. My girlfriend at the time was house sitting about a half hour away. Near 1 a.m. she called me, panicked because she thought she heard someone walking around outside. She asked me to come stay with her. Worried, I quickly threw on some clothes and headed out. There was a way to save some time by cutting through the abandoned parts of the base. It was a shortcut, and since I was in a hurry, it seemed like the best option. There was no power in this part of the base, so the streetlights weren't working. It was pitch black except for the light from my headlights. As I was driving down this back road, I suddenly saw flashing lights. I was being pulled over. I was speeding, but I was in a remote area. I pulled over. The officer got out and asked for my license and registration. I handed them over and explained that I had received a call from my girlfriend and was rushing to make sure she was safe. The officer went back to his car and just sat there. A few minutes later, another police car arrived. I could see them talking and staring at me through the rearview mirror. Finally, the new officer came up to my car and said, "Get out of the car." I asked why, but he just repeated the order. Once I was out of the car, I realized both cars had 2 officers in them, so now I was facing 4 officers. They had me stand to the side while they started searching my car. One of them said, "You seem to be in a big hurry in the middle of the night. What were you running from?" I was shocked by the accusation, but explained the story I had told the first officer. He turned away. The next officer commented on my car, saying it looked nice, and because it was so late and I was driving fast, it seemed like I had stolen it. I pointed out that the registration and my license all matched. The officers started talking again. One stayed with me while the other 3 huddled together. Then, out of nowhere, 2 more police cars and 4 more officers showed up. Keep in mind, this was a deserted road at around 1:30 a.m. with no lights. The 7 officers began talking while one stayed with me. One officer went back into my car and pulled out a bag of tortillas that I assumed had fallen out of a grocery bag earlier. He then said, "This kid was speeding in the middle of the night with food and supplies in his car. Sounds like someone who did something and needed to get away and hide for a while." At this point, I was both scared and angry at the absurdity of what was happening, not to mention still worried about my girlfriend's call. The officers looked at me waiting for a reply. I didn't really know what to say. Finally, one officer said, "You see the wear on these tires? This wear is from someone who does a lot of high-speed driving. You must like to speed, huh?" I said, "Yeah, man, all the damn time," angrily. As soon as I said it, I wished I could take the words back. The officer's face froze, like this was the moment he had been waiting for. He looked at the other 7 officers, then went back to his car and opened the trunk. I had no idea why. The officer who was standing near me then asked, "Where are you from?" I replied, "Marin County." Another officer overheard and said, "Oh, that's the town of Barbara Boxer, but I won't hold that too much against you." Barbara Boxer was a senator. I wish I could say I planned this, but out of my incredibly nervous mouth I blurted out, "Yeah, Diana Feinstein too, she's my neighbor." Feinstein was senator at that point. The truth was we lived near each other and I met her once, but that was it. The officer at the trunk overheard and asked, "What did that kid say?" The officer next to me said, "Kid says he's neighbors with Feinstein." They all paused and looked at each other. The trunk officer closed his trunk, came up to me, got in my face, and said, "Get the hell out of here." I got back in my car. The whole episode took 45 minutes. I drove to a main roadway and finally to my girlfriend, who was also worried because a 30-minute drive had taken me over an hour. No cell phones back then. I still have no idea what was going on or what would have happened if my nervous mouth hadn't blurted that out. I never thought I'd share this story with anyone. I was nearly 11 at the time, living in a small town in Arkansas. My parents had split up when I was young, and my dad often relied on others to sustain his life. If he wasn't living with someone else, he was staying with his parents. My mom was too busy working or was often sick, so we couldn't live with her. Instead, we lived with our grandparents and sometimes with Dad as well. At the time, Dad was in a so-called committed relationship with a woman we'll call Amy, and she had a daughter named Samantha. Samantha was only a year younger than me. Meanwhile, my sister was 2 years older than me, so I ended up being better friends with Samantha. Downtown, there was a big old park that had been there since my sister and I were babies. It had a lake with a dock where you could walk out and view the water. Samantha and I were playing on the dock, spotting ducks and fish, while Dad and Amy were sitting at a picnic table about 3/4 of the length of a football field away, chatting. My sister hadn't come, so it was just Samantha and me. Samantha was counting the ducks and trying to call them over while I watched the bubbles forming on the water from the fish swimming below. After only a few minutes, we heard footsteps on the dock. It was easy to hear because the dock was all wood and footsteps were quite audible. The dock is shaped like a T. You walk onto it, continue a bit, and then there's an intersection leading to viewing areas, all open space and surrounded by wood and railings. Samantha and I were on the right side of the dock with our backs to the person approaching us. We figured it was a fisherman, which wasn't uncommon, so we ignored it. However, when the person got closer, I turned around and was immediately unnerved. It wasn't my dad. It was a tall man about 6 feet 3 inches, wearing a dirty tan coat, a white t-shirt covered in brown stains, and jeans. He stood uncomfortably close, and the smell of gasoline stung my nose. The way the dock was built, he blocked most of the space, making it difficult to escape unless we jumped over the benches on either side. Instinctively, I grabbed Samantha's hand and locked eyes with the man, trying to convey a message. "Not today, man." "I'm sorry, are we in your way?" I said, trying to sound older and more serious. I hoped maybe he'd back off. He didn't say anything and just looked at us. Suddenly, he smiled, a wicked, malicious, and sadistic smile, revealing rotten teeth and tobacco stains. "Are you ladies alone?" I heard Samantha whimper beside me and I cleared my throat. "No, my dad is right over there," I said, pointing across the way without breaking eye contact. "And he's a cop, so if I were you, I'd find another pair of kids." I regretted saying it as soon as the words left my mouth. I had a habit of saying whatever was on my mind immediately. His smile faded, and his expression became dangerously cold. He reached out with his grimy fingers and grabbed a lock of Samantha's hair, twirling it around. "You have real pretty hair, sweetheart," he said. Samantha screamed and the man began to panic. In that moment, I shoved him as hard as I could and grabbed Samantha. We ran down the dock and straight to our parents. By then, Amy had gone back to the car and Dad was throwing away some trash. I looked back and saw the man disappearing into a white pickup truck parked behind the tree line. We didn't tell our parents. We didn't tell anyone. They didn't even hear Samantha scream. I've been back to that dock since, but I've never let anyone corner me again. I never smile at strangers. I give them the same cold stare I gave that man, the kind that says, "Find another kid." Samantha and Amy are out of our lives now, but I doubt she'll ever forget that experience. I certainly won't. As a Balkan guy living in Austria, the tradition of Krampus isn't new to me. We have similar traditions in Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and most other Balkan countries. However, here in Austria, Krampus shows and parades can get pretty violent. It's not as bad as it was about 10 to 15 years ago, but it can still be quite intense in some rare cases today. Inspired by the traditions of our southern neighbors, pyrotechnics have become common at Krampus shows and parades. Some groups seem to spend more time and money on impressive fireworks displays than on their wooden, hand-carved, and unique masks. This happened on December 2nd, 2014. In my village, there was a very large Krampus parade. Unfortunately, the parade route crossed right in front of my workplace, a restaurant. It was about 8 p.m., and our restaurant was filled with guests, mostly kids with their parents. I was in the office calculating my order for our supplier when I heard children screaming in fear. I rushed to the bar counter and saw 3 Krampus figures with horrifying masks surrounding 2 small Turkish kids. As a foreigner living in Austria, I know that many people in rural areas don't like foreigners, especially Muslims. Those kids were clearly both. One of the Krampus figures, who had a particularly terrifying mask with long teeth, a long tongue sticking out, and large goat horns, held a trident with a Bengal fire attached to it. This filled the entire guest room with smoke and a sulfuric smell, which I recognized from football stadiums. He wore thick black fur and had a heavy iron chain as a belt. The other Krampus figures had scary masks too, but the one with the goat horns was clearly the scariest and seemed to be the leader. All Krampus figures also had large cowbells attached to their costumes, and in recent years they added small red or blue LED lights above their eye holes for a glowing effect. I looked into the kitchen and called for Demir and Flamur, 2 cooks who were also in my kickboxing club. They quickly came to help, understanding the situation without needing further explanation. We grouped at the bar where 2 female service employees were crouched on the floor. We made our way around the counter and approached the scene. Many people, even grown men, just stood by and watched as the 3 Krampus figures surrounded the children. Their mother, who was a few meters behind, was shouting and crying at the masked men. I grabbed the leader by his shoulder, forgetting that I had been terrified of Krampus as a kid, and pulled him back half a meter. My friend Demir grabbed the trident, while Flamur blocked one of the other Krampus figures, making the third one back up. The leader started to scream under his heavy mask, using a lot of swear words, and I could smell the alcohol through the holes in his wooden mask. He tried to push me back, but Demir held his other arm, and we pulled him toward the exit where the parade was still passing by. His friends rushed outside, grabbed him, and pulled him into the crowd of Krampus figures moving past our restaurant. In Austria, Krampus figures are required to wear identification numbers to reduce the chance of assaults on people, but all 3 of these Krampus figures had none. While Flamur and Demir went back inside to open all the windows, the smoke from the fire was burning our eyes and throats. I went into the parade to find someone responsible or a police officer to talk to. After a few minutes, and with the help of 2 girls dressed as angels, who were part of the parade, I found the vice mayor of our village and told him what happened. Unfortunately, many Krampus figures wore large goat horns as they were a trend at the time, and my description matched too many of them. After filing a police report, I went back to the restaurant and finished my shift as usual. When I was done, I left as the last one. I went outside, locked the door, lit a cigarette, and walked to my car a few corners away. I thought I heard the faint sound of cowbells in the distance, but shrugged it off. On one side of the street were buildings, and on the other side was a field bordering a forest. As I reached my car and pressed the button on my key, I clearly heard cowbells behind me. Behind me was only the dark forest. I stared frozen but saw nothing. I turned and opened my car door when suddenly a loud growl came from the forest, and I saw 2 dim red lights at the edge of the tree line. Then 4, then 6, then 8, then 10. And I squinted at the trees to make out details, and after a few seconds it was clear that dark figures with glowing eyes were emerging from the thicket into the field. I quickly got into my car, put it in reverse, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. At least 5 Krampus figures stood in the forest trying to scare me. Or maybe it wasn't aimed at me. I'll probably never know, but after the incident at the restaurant, I doubt it was a coincidence. I don't know if everyone will find this story scary, but for me it absolutely made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In England, there's a festival called Glastonbury. It takes place in Somerset and is the biggest festival in England. It lasts 5 days and is mostly a music festival, but it also features dance, theater, circus performances, and comedy. In the late 80s or early 90s, my dad worked security at Glastonbury with a few friends. His job was to drive around the festival's perimeter in a truck to catch people trying to sneak in. On the second day, my dad and his friend were driving around and heard some people on the other side of the wall trying to sneak in. Usually, people throw their bags over first, so they parked the truck by the wall and got out. A few seconds later, the bags came thumping down on the truck's roof, followed by 2 people. They were halfway over the wall when they saw my dad and his friend in security uniforms, looking intimidating. They froze, unsure of what to do. After a few moments of silence, my dad and his friend broke into big smiles. They told the people to jump over and they'd drive them to the main part of the festival. This wasn't a trick. My dad and his friend didn't care much if people were trying to sneak in, as long as they didn't cause trouble. While driving the group to the main part of the festival, my dad and his friend received a call over the radio. Another security member asked them to check out the toilets because someone had reported being bitten on the ass. Confused, my dad and his friend asked if the caller was joking. They were told no, but the person who reported it was clearly high, so it was probably nothing, but they should check just in case. These were festival toilets, temporary setups over what was basically a cesspit. Unsure of what they were looking for, they checked the toilets but didn't find anything. They continued their patrol and heard more calls over the radio about people being bitten on the ass. Other security members who checked the toilets found nothing. The assumption was that it was a joke or a rumor started by people who were high. A call came through the radio directed at my dad and his friend. A 4th person had reported being bitten on the ass, and this time the woman had a large bite mark that had broken the skin. She showed it to a medic who confirmed it was definitely a human bite mark. Still very confused, my dad and his friend raced back to the toilets. They went into a cubicle and shined a light down the toilet. Right before they were about to turn off the torch, they saw something unusual move. My dad's friend, not knowing what else to do, called out, "Is there someone down there?" They saw the faster movement this time. He called out again, "We aren't going to hurt you, we just need to know if there's someone down there." There was no response. Then suddenly a head popped up out of the toilet. It was a man wearing a snorkel and swimming goggles. Stunned, my dad asked him how he got down there. The man said he had tunneled in. My dad and his friend took part of the toilet apart to help him get out. Covered head to toe in feces, he was escorted by my dad and his friend to the security area. No one really knew what to make of it. While they waited for the police, the man talked to my dad. He said he had arrived at the festival a week or two early and dug a tunnel from the edge of a neighboring field. He intended to sit below the toilets and bite people when they sat down. He also claimed this was the first time he had been caught, implying he had done it before, though my dad wasn't sure if this was true. According to my dad and his friend, the man was incredibly friendly and polite, but seemed dead behind the eyes. Like even if he was looking at you, it was as if you weren't there. On more than one occasion, the man licked his lips, which wasn't exactly sanitary by any stretch of the imagination. He wouldn't answer questions about his name and just talked about the festival. At one point, while he was praising the festival, my dad's friend swore he heard him say under his breath, "A shame they don't let children in." The police took their time arriving, which my dad understood, and he didn't know what happened to the man afterward. I remember feeling sick when my dad first told me the story. It's safe to say I was terrified of using portable or outdoor toilets after that. To clarify, my dad and his friend always stressed that the man was seriously mentally ill. He seemed completely unbothered by what he was doing and unaware it was wrong. To start this story, it's important to know that my dad was never a good father. He lacked all the qualities of a normal, mentally healthy father, and we lived in very low-income housing. When he was in high school, he was told he couldn't have kids due to a car accident that left his reproductive organs damaged. Unfortunately, he could still have children. In his 20s and 30s, he had 13 kids, and now there are 15 in total. I was 13 at the time. Even though I lived with my father on a week-on, week-off basis, it felt like I never really got to know him. I was only introduced to one of his other children, my older half-sister. I don't even know her mother. A lot of this memory has been repressed, so details might be unclear. I'm 21 now and only recently fully acknowledged these events. I even confirmed the details with my mom. When I was 10, someone came into our apartment. I can't remember his name, but he claimed to be one of my father's long-lost children. He appeared to be in his late teens to early 20s, and asked if he could stay with us for a while he tried to get back on his feet after moving from California to Oregon. He didn't have many belongings, just an old laptop. He was rough around the edges, with mid-length hair, a light shadow on his face, and he was fairly skinny and tall. My dad was always strange about him. He told me this was my brother. He was family, and he would be taking my room for a bit while I slept in the living room. What was odd was that my dad never let me enter my old room. Even though my new brother seemed kind of odd, he was a cool guy. We played Minecraft together on a local network, and he showed me the game he was programming, which was similar to Skyrim. He stayed with us for about a month. One night, while we were having a Minecraft redstone competition to see who could make the better build, something terrible happened. It was past midnight when I heard screaming. My father was yelling, and there was loud banging coming from the wall in our apartment. After about 30 seconds of banging, I saw my father in a fit of rage, chasing out my brother, who was running out of the apartment holding a knife. My dad chased him outside but came back to check on us. Later that night, I went to sleep with my dad sitting in the living room, guarding the apartment until dawn. Months later, I learned what had really happened that night. According to my father, who liked to embellish stories, the person pretending to be my brother had gone into my dad's room late at night and stabbed him in the chest while he was sleeping. My dad woke up, and because of his previous military experience, he quickly sprang into action. He tackled the attacker who was trying to stab my younger sister and fought him off. After a struggle, the attacker managed to escape. My mom later confirmed the story and added some details. She saw the stab wound herself and said it wasn't severe. She patched him up because he couldn't afford a hospital visit. I also told her about the incident, though I don't remember doing so. The police came by at some point and found that the impersonator was wanted in California, Oregon, and Washington for various crimes. I don't remember his name, so I don't know if he was ever caught. So to wrap this up, is there really a good way to wrap this up? Don't let random people in your house. I work a graveyard shift as a security guard for a recycling yard. For privacy reasons, I can't disclose the company's name. I've been on this site for 2 weeks, and this is my second week here. Every hour I make rounds across a large recycling yard filled with broken down precious metals that are sold. During my shift, I scan various checkpoints to ensure no one else is in the yard or facility. One of my tasks is to walk through some grassy and bushy areas and cross a set of train tracks to take a photo of a warehouse far across the yard. This is to make sure everything is safe and clear. I use a flashlight with 2,000 lumens so I can see across the entire yard. About an hour and a half ago during my round, I walked through the grass and over the train tracks. I took the photo of the warehouse and submitted it. Suddenly, I felt an intense sense of being watched. My neck hairs stood up and I froze. My flashlight was still on, pointing at the warehouse. I slowly turned around and pointed my flashlight behind me. To my shock, about 10 yards away, I saw a skinny, old wrinkled white man with a large white beard, sitting in a chair. He was looking directly at me. He was wearing dirty jean overalls and what looked like a Western-style cowboy fedora. He was bare-skinned under the overalls. I'm a 6-foot, 220-pound man, but I screamed Jesus Christ at a pitch that was embarrassing. In my shock, I dropped my flashlight. The ground was covered in tiny metal shards, so I couldn't see anything. All I could hear were quick, metal-crunching footsteps rapidly approaching me. When the footsteps were within about 5 feet, they suddenly veered to the left and moved past me. Within a few seconds, the clanging disappeared, followed by the sound of rustling bushes. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground, pointed it towards the sound, and saw that the old man had disappeared, having gone past the bushes. I was shaking with adrenaline and fear. I managed to catch my breath and called several emergency contacts. By the time they arrived, the old man was long gone. I think he might have been there just to watch the trains move across the tracks. The metal chair was facing the tracks and it's still there. I took a photo of it as a memento. This group doesn't allow photos, so I can't share it. I'm now in the office, still terrified and alone. I have to finish my shift tonight and work another 11-hour graveyard shift tomorrow. I won't quit because I need the money, but I just needed to get this off my chest.